Hello. At some point in our lives, we all ask ourselves some basic questions about the meaning of life. We want to know why we're here, where we're going to go when we die, and we need to know whether there is a God, and if there is, why did God create man and the universe? And in our century, the traditional religious understandings seem less convincing than they once did. We live in a scientific era, and we need explanations that are scientific, logical, and agree with our common sense. According to the divine principle, the relationship between God and man should be similar to the relationship between a man's mind and his body. In a healthy individual, the mind is able to control the body, and in this way we go about our daily lives. But occasionally, and an example would be after a severe accident, the body can be paralyzed so that the commands of the mind no longer reach the members. This is a very frustrating and difficult situation. Our mind may be still as alive and vital as ever, but because the body is no longer able to carry out the mind's desires, frustration and difficulty are bound to set in. And for God and the world, the situation is just like that. God is like the mind of the universe. He has an ideal and a purpose, but man, the object of his ideal, lies paralyzed and senseless, often unaware of whether God even exists or not. God is frustrated by this situation. He doesn't want it to continue. And for that reason, throughout history, he sent prophets and saints, men with a vision to explain to mankind about the purpose of life. Today, as we've said, we need a new revelation and a new understanding from God that can fully answer the age-old questions of the purpose and the meaning of our life. How can we know the nature of God, who's invisible? The best way of doing it will be to look at the things that God has made. We're used to this idea when it comes to knowing about a man whom we can no longer meet in person. For example, to understand about the mind and character of Vincent van Gogh, the best way is to look at his paintings and find out his character from the way he expressed himself on the canvas. In the same way, we can understand a lot about the nature and character of God by looking at the things he made, man and the universe. For this reason, Paul said in Romans 1:20, "Ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, have been clearly perceived in the things that have been made." So, by looking at the world of creation, we're going to understand some fundamental points about the nature and the character of God. First of all, let's look at the dual characteristics of God and his world of creation. When we look at the world, we can see that all beings have a duality between internal character and external form. Looking at man, there's the internal, invisible mind and the external, visible body. And as we already discussed, the mind controls and directs the body to fulfill the purpose of life. When we think about what gives a person his value, we realize that it's actually the invisible, internal nature of his heart and spirit. Our friends are the people that we feel comfortable with. They may not be the most beautiful people around, but in the warmth of their love and the pleasantness of their personality, we perceive value. If someone has a mean spirit, is unfriendly and unloving, then we regard that person as being someone we don't want to know. We don't really think that a person's body, the color of his skin, the race or nationality that he comes from, is what is fundamentally important about a person. The dual characteristics of internal character and external form are also seen in the animal kingdom. And our commonest experience of this is in the instinct of animals and birds. It's truly amazing, isn't it, how birds are able to migrate across thousands of miles year after year, coming back to the very same places. Truly a miracle. Plants also have an internal sensitivity. Of course, they don't migrate or do anything like that, yet they do know how to seek after light and water, and some people say that if you sing and talk to your plants, they'll grow better. In the mineral kingdom, between molecules, atoms, and particles, there's also an inherent directive nature, physical and chemical laws which determine how these particles relate with each other to form the different compounds and minerals of life. So, from the most complicated of creation, men, to the least complicated, atoms and particles, we see this duality of internal, invisible character and external, visible form. And we can conclude that these same characteristics are also found within God, who projected himself into the creation. Another set of dual characteristics we need to look at is that between masculinity and femininity, or positivity and negativity. Mankind, of course, is divided into men and women, and a good thing it is too. Without this, there could be no romance, no love, no families, and in the end, no continuation of the species. And of course, the animal kingdom also has male and female animals, and plants likewise have male and female plants. In the mineral kingdom, we don't see masculinity and femininity, of course, but we do see positive and negative molecules, atoms, and particles. And this dual characteristic of masculinity and femininity, or positivity and negativity, is also a reflection of the nature of God. In Genesis 1:27, the Bible says, God created them in his image, male and female he created them. So the traditional understanding of God as an old man with a long beard in the sky in any way would only be half complete. God is not just a father to mankind, but he's also a mother. He has masculine qualities and feminine qualities too. More than that, we can understand that just as man feels, thinks, and desires, these qualities must also be present in God. God is not an unfeeling, unthinking force who created the universe and forgot about it, but he's intimately connected with men and with his creation. He has a will, he has a desire, and he has a purpose which he wants to express in the things that he made. Also, if we look at human beings, we see that the central value of a man's life is love. Even though we may be surrounded with many material things, nice house, nice food, if we don't feel loved, then our life is empty and valueless. And this characteristic also comes from God. The very essence of God's personality is his love and his heart, and it was for this reason that he created the universe. So to summarize this section, the nature of God is most clearly expressed in the things that he created. We've understood that God is a God of feeling, thinking, and will, and that God had a purpose for creating which was centrally connected with love. Now let's look at universal prime force, give and take action, and the four-position foundation. Universal prime force sounds like a terrifying technical term, but what we mean by this is simply that all things of the creation have their origin in God, and that God himself is the source of energy and power which has existed from the very beginning. The universal prime force is the causal force behind all things, and causes them to enter into what we call give and take action. We already discussed that God has within himself dual characteristics: internal character, external form, positivity and negativity. And from the origin of God, these dual characteristics separate themselves into subject and object pairs. And these subjects and objects are to have what we call give and take action between them, and from this relationship comes new creation, new life, the union. We can easily understand this by looking at the example of a family. Starting with the origin in God, the husband and the wife have a give and take action of love, and the union or the result is a family and children, which will develop eventually into a society, a nation, and a world. Any aspect of man's life depends largely on the relationships that we make. We know that in our family, good relationships are vital for being happy and satisfied. And yet the fact is that divorces are rising, children are running away from home, there's the increasing level of child abuse, and the problem is staring us in the face that we don't know how to have happy relationships in our family. At work, good give and take between employer and employee will mean good productivity, but we're all too familiar with the strikes and clock watching that results when give and take breaks down. No sport, no art, none of the finer things in life can really be enjoyed without give and take action. And if we take an example from the scientific world, we can understand just how important relationships are. If we think of the hydrogen atom, it consists of a very small proton and an even smaller electron. And as this example shows, the two are separated by an unimaginable distance. And yet, these two tiny pieces of matter, when they enter into give and take relationship, create a real existence, an atom of hydrogen which can then go on to make water and the other building blocks of life. So, right give and take action is essential both in the created world, scientific world, and also in human life. And it's no surprise, therefore, to realize that in God's original ideal, good give and take action between God and man was the essential part. God wanted to be able to freely express himself to man and for man to respond in an ideal way. And through this, the foundation of an ideal and happy life for God and man was to have been created. Looking at the process of development, we see that the origin that started in God is developed into the subject and object pairs and then into the union. And this forms what we call the four-position foundation, which is the fundamental base by which God expresses himself in the universe. And we've already looked at the example of the family as the most essential example of the four-position foundation. Now we want to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of life? Why are we here? Why were we created? To understand about the motivation behind God's creating the universe may seem like an enormous task, but we've already understood that God's nature is reflected in man. Therefore, if we look at why man creates, we'll be able to understand why God himself created and started his creation. We always do things because we want to experience joy and happiness. No one ever does something in the expectation that by doing so, he'll be totally miserable and unhappy. You're not sitting here listening to this lecture because you want to be bored or you want to be made unhappy. You're hoping that you can gain something from it. Even though sometimes we may have to endure suffering or sacrifice to achieve some purpose, ultimately our desire is always to receive joy. And yet, how is joy produced? It needs both a subject and an object. There must be someone to do the giving and someone or something to receive the love and the feeling that's being given out. And again, if we look at human relationships, we see that men seek for joy in many ways. Some people look for it in money. But is money really the ultimate source of joy? We know that it isn't. If you turn on the radio today and listen to the popular songs, you'll hear almost every song is about love, isn't it? Love lost, love gained, love hoped for, and so on. You don't hear many songs about money, and even fewer about power or knowledge. But it's very ironic that men, in seeking to be happy, are looking for almost everything but what they really need, which is true love. But how do we experience true love? We need an object, and that object can't be just a rock, or even an animal or a plant. Ultimately, it must be another person. And that person must be able to respond absolutely to our deepest thinking, our deepest feeling, and our deepest desires. The family is the place where we can really experience love in all its dimensions. For God, the situation is exactly the same. God also has the desire to share his love and his heart with some object. And the object for God is man. By the fact that God gave man the commandment, as recorded in Genesis 2:17, we can understand that men are created to understand the heart and the desire of God and to respond to that completely. Just as all parents want their children to be as good as they were or better, so God's ultimate desire for man is that we become like second gods, having the same value and the same meaning in our life as God has in his. How then do we go about achieving this wonderful ideal? If we look in the Bible, Genesis 1:28 gives a clue where God blesses Adam and Eve with the three great blessings. And he blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful, multiply, and have dominion over the things of the earth." What do these three great blessings mean for modern man? The first blessing, to be fruitful, is a commandment to man to mature and perfect his character. By growing up, we're supposed to be people who can embody the love and the feeling of God completely, and in our sharing with other people and with God, we manifest the true humanity with which we were endowed. So being perfect does not mean being able to leap tall buildings with a single bound. Rather, it means being able to feel and think and love as God does. That's why Jesus said in Matthew 5:48, "You must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect." And Paul in 1 Corinthians said, "Do you not know that you're God's temple and God's Spirit dwells within you?" So this is the ultimate purpose of human life, to be the temple of the living God. And God expressing himself in our daily life helps us to love and act exactly in accordance with his will. But individual perfection is only part of the story. The second blessing calls for ideal men and ideal women to create perfect families, and in the expression of their love, to have children, a society, a nation, and a world of true and ideal love. In an ideal world that started from a perfect family, we wouldn't expect to see a division of language. There would not be conflict or war, and we certainly wouldn't allow people to starve. But even the creation of ideal families is not the end of God's blessing to man. He also wants us to enjoy a perfect living standard, and for this reason, God gave man the third blessing, which is to have dominion over the natural world and to care for it with love. We can see in this century how incredible have been the developments of science and technology. But all too often, these developments have not been used exclusively for the betterment of mankind. It's ironic indeed that some of the major efforts and the most expenditure of money goes into weapons technology rather than in solving the problems of disease and hunger. Martin Luther King commented that the great tragedy of the 20th century was that we have guided missiles, but misguided men. Now, let's understand how man is to fulfill these three great blessings and how we're to grow to our maturity. We understand that for anything to develop, a period of time is needed. The universe didn't come into existence overnight. We're told that it took between 4 and 15 billion years for the world to be as it is today. And even in the growth of man, a time period is needed by which we mature and develop ourselves. And the principle identifies 3 stages of growth, which we call the formation, the growth, and the completion stages. The Bible makes reference to this also in the creation story in Genesis by talking about the evening, night, and morning that divided each day of God's creation. Now, for all the other things of the creation, the passage from formation, growth to completion is an automatic one brought about by the force of the principle. For example, an acorn will, if planted in sufficiently fertile soil, develop automatically over a period of many years to become a mighty oak tree. And we should note here that completion means the beginning of the mature life of the tree. So after completion, you could say the real life of the oak tree begins. Well, for human beings, the situation is a little more complicated. The physical nature of man develops according to certain laws and principles largely beyond our control. We can't decide, for example, what color our eyes or hair are going to be, or how tall we'll end up, and even our attempts to control our weight are often met with difficulty. But the internal nature of man, his spirit and character, is very much our responsibility. During the period of growing, each person is supposed to make in himself the image of God by fulfilling his own portion of responsibility. This stage of human life we call the indirect dominion of God. And what this means is that the relationship between God and man is not a direct one. God gives his words, his direction to men, and if we follow them, which is our responsibility alone to do, then we can grow through the 3 stages spiritually and finally enter the direct dominion of God's love. Now, the direct dominion of God is the place where God's feelings and our feelings are one, where God's love and our love is one, and where we truly become divine beings. Once we reach this stage, we're no longer capable of committing sins or crimes or making any mistakes. But the journey to that stage of the direct dominion is the time when man is fully responsible for his own development. The responsibility for man's perfection comes from God to man as a precious gift. Of course, God is in reality taking most of the responsibility himself. He created the world and he caused us to be born, and through the medium of our parents, he's taken care of our physical needs. But we do have a small portion of responsibility, we could call it 5%, to grow and develop ourselves. It's as if God was a master stonemason and he's laid almost all the blocks in a magnificent stone wall, but the last stone he's left to us to put into place. He gives us the training and the tools necessary to do the job, but then he stands back and allows us to complete the work. The tragedy of human life today is that men have never taken their responsibility before God. We don't see people of an ideal character on the earth. Far less do we see perfect families, and we know that we're not taking responsibility for the world in the right way. So the reason that men continue to suffer and struggle is not because God doesn't care or God is not able or powerful to deal with the problem. It's because man has failed to fulfill his own portion of responsibility. So the conclusion of the miserable history of suffering of man and the beginning of the kingdom of God is waiting for one thing and one thing only: man's acceptance and fulfillment of his own portion of responsibility, which even God cannot intervene with. Finally, we need to understand more clearly about the nature of the spiritual life and the question of life after death. We've already indicated that man has 2 parts to his nature: an internal, invisible side, which we've called the mind or spirit, and the external, visible form, the physical self. And as this diagram shows, we can look at this in 2 separate areas. We have a physical self and we have a spirit self. Now, the physical self we're familiar with. We see it every day. And this has a physical mind and a physical body. The physical mind is the unconscious functioning of the human body that causes us to breathe, to digest our food, instructs the heart to pump, and so on. The physical body consists of the cells and organs with which we're familiar. For the physical self to grow, there needs to be a good relationship of give and take between the physical mind and the physical body. And in addition to that, certain nutrients are needed from the outside. One group of nutrients we call positive nutrients, and they include sunlight, warmth, and the air that we breathe. These things come free, but we need them absolutely to be able to grow. We also need what we call negative nutrients, namely food and water. And providing we get enough of all of these elements, then we will grow physically until we reach our maturity. But what about the spirit self? The spirit self is invisible to us today, and many people are even unaware that it exists. But it does exist, and like the physical self, it consists of a mind and a body. Now, the spiritual mind is the center of our conscious feeling, thoughts, and actions. And the spiritual body resembles the physical body in every respect, but is made of spiritual elements. Now, this spirit self also needs to grow. Certain elements also come for free from God. We call them life elements, and they include God's truth, His love, and the spiritual atmosphere. But the spirit also needs food to grow. And these elements we call the vitality elements, and they come from the actions of the physical body. Now this may seem very arcane, but actually we're familiar with this principle in our daily life. For example, if we do a good deed, help an old lady across the road, we're all aware that we feel good afterwards. Why is that? It's because by doing the good deed, we have nurtured and fed our spirit, and in return, the spirit is giving living spirit elements back to the body. On the other hand, when we commit a crime, we feel bad, not just physically sick, but uncomfortable. And the reason is that we've poisoned our spirit with bad vitality elements. Because we can't see our spiritual self today, we often make mistakes which cause us to damage our eternal selves. Perhaps you've read the book by Oscar Wilde, The Picture of Dorian Gray. Actually, this gives a very clear example of the relationship between body and spirit. Dorian Gray makes a wish that he will always resemble a beautiful portrait done of him. And this portrait is a resemblance of the spirit self. His wish is granted, and as he goes through his life, he stays the same externally, but the portrait becomes hideously disfigured as he himself commits many crimes and atrocities. This is indeed an illustration of the spirit self invisibly being deformed and changed by the actions of the physical body. Eventually, he can no longer stand the hideousness of the painting and tries to destroy it, but in doing so, destroys himself. It's exactly the same with man. Even though we may want to destroy our spiritual self, we cannot. We create it by the quality of the lives that we live. And at the end of the day, who we are is what we've made of ourselves. Now, the physical self lives only for 70 years, but the spiritual self is eternal. This means that our life here on the earth is an extremely precious time. Our purpose for being here is to learn how to develop our spirit by living and loving according with God's will. And if we don't do that, but we live in a wrong way, then we'll poison our spirit and deform it. And we may even find that our spirit becomes less than human. What happens at the point of death is simply that the physical body ceases to exist, but the spiritual mind and the spiritual body continue forever in the eternal world. In one sense, it's just like taking off a jacket. So when we die, we're not told by God whether we can go to heaven or hell. We've already decided it by the quality of the life that we've lived. Now, we said earlier that the spirit self receives certain elements from God called life elements. And the truth is equivalent to light in this physical world. God's love equivalent to warmth. And the atmosphere of spiritual truth is like the atmosphere of the world we live in. So if we've lived a good life, then we'll go to a realm where there is truth, love, and good atmosphere. In other words, it will be like a sunny spring day. But if the quality of our life has been poor, then the reality we've made for ourselves is a realm devoid of light, devoid of warmth, and with a poisonous atmosphere. Truly, we can call it hell. And once we're in the spiritual world, it's very difficult for us to change ourselves because we no longer have the physical body with which to generate food for our spirit. From this we can understand that it's absolutely essential that while we're alive here on the earth, we understand the purpose and the meaning of our life. That we live in accordance with the principle of God, and by doing so, we make ourselves into perfected people. If we don't do that during our life on the earth, we'll be tortured by regret in the life afterwards, because we won't be able to enjoy the kingdom of love that God has prepared. For this reason, Jesus said, whatever you bind on the earth will be bound on heaven. In other words, unless we can create the kingdom of God here on the earth, it will never exist in the eternal world either. God is the loving parent of all mankind. He He wants us to be happy. That was why he created man and the universe. And he's given us everything we need to live eternally with him in joy. But man also has a portion of responsibility to fulfill, a responsibility with which even God cannot interfere. It's up to us to grow to reach perfection. It remains our responsibility through the ages. In the next lecture, we'll be understanding why the ideal of God doesn't exist on the earth. What is the problem that has separated God from man since the beginning of history?